My name's Trevor Erlacher. The title of the book is Ukrainian Nationalism in the Age of Extremes, an intellectual biography of Dmytro Dontsov. I wrote this book because I wanted to write an intellectual history of Ukrainian nationalism in the 20th century, focusing on the sort of far right, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and the ideological and intellectual origins of that movement. And I thought that Dontsov would be a really good character to look at, a good figure to study, to understand where these ideas came from and how they developed over the course of the 20th century because of the circumstances of his life and the enormous influence that he had on the students and veterans who went on to become members and leaders of the OUN. I first became associated with the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute when I was a student, a graduate student. I went to the Harvard Ukrainian Summer Institute at Iurii, and that's where I learned how to read Ukrainian when I was really just starting in the field. And so when it came time to publish my dissertation, to rework it into a book, that was one of the first places I thought of. Most of his archival materials are at the National Archives in Warsaw, and this is partly because, again, the circumstances of his life. He spent most of his adult life in interwar Poland, in the Second Polish Republic, in what is today Western Ukraine, the city of Lviv. And so after his death and after he had moved overseas to Canada, most of those papers ended up with the Polish authorities and have stayed there to the present day. So I tried to strike a balance here between his personal life, his psychology, his associations, family, and so on. What makes someone into a nationalist, right? What makes someone into this figure on the right? But I also wanted to use his biography as a kind of microhistory, right? As a way of looking at much larger scale developments in Eastern and Central Europe, and then eventually in North America. And his biography really lends itself to that because of just how peripatetic, how cosmopolitan his life was. He goes from Eastern Ukraine to St. Petersburg to Kyiv, then to Vienna, Lviv, and then eventually to Canada. And every step of the way, he is interacting with these international networks of political activists, of academics, of governments. And so he's very sort of tied into all of these major historical episodes in the Age of Extremes. He was quite well educated. He went to gymnasium in Ukraine and then on to St. Petersburg University. And that's really where he sort of gets his political education initially. He joins the Social Democrats. And then from there goes to the University of Vienna to complete his doctorate in law and philosophy, focusing on sort of German law. So he was quite well educated. He was a doctor, but instead of pursuing the academic route, he pursued more of the journalistic, political activist, and diplomatic route. Initially, he was a Marxist. He was a leftist, someone who worked closely with Symon Petliura and wrote for the Socialist Press in Kyiv. But then, through his experience in the First World War, he moved to the right. He rejected socialism. He rejected Marxism, and began writing a lot more for the nationalist press. And I would say he was most influential as an editor for the journal Literaturno-naukovий Вістник, right? So the Literary-Scientific Herald. This is kind of the premier publication for Ukrainian literary and political work all through the late 19th century and up to the 1920s when he was in charge. And then eventually he had his own version of that same publication, simply Vystnik, in the 1930s. He was a very polarizing figure in his lifetime and all the way up to the present day. His admirers thought he was a genius, thought he was a great thinker, someone who had created a new worldview for Ukrainians, right? That he had presented this new idea for them to follow into the future. But his critics saw him more as a plagiarist, as someone who had basically copied fascist ideas from Europe and was corrupting the youth, was attacking his opponents unfairly, was very authoritarian as an editor, and used his power, his influence to create a very simplistic view of Ukrainian politics and Ukraine's situation in the world. It's important to understand that during the First World War, he was a kind of secret agent for the Central Powers, someone who was deeply involved in propaganda for the German Empire, for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who tried to present the war on the Eastern Front as a war for the liberation of non-Russian nationalities, right, where the Russian Empire is the prime enemy. And so he had this great network of connections in Central Europe, and he used that when he came to work for Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky. So the short-lived Ukrainian state, this was a government existed in Ukraine for a certain number of months in 1918. It was supported by the Central Powers. And in that regime, Dontsov was the minister of the telegraph agency, someone who dealt with the kind of public relations, the communications of the government to the people, and also someone who brokered a peace with the Soviet state, the nascent Soviet state. So in that sense, he was involved in making these decisions. He was talking to Skoropadsky, trying to get him to take a more aggressive pro-Ukrainian approach to governing, but there were a lot of divisions in that government too, because Skoropadsky and many of his connections and from his time in the Russian military also wanted to reconstitute the Russian Empire and defeat Bolshevism. So there's a sort of a tension between Russian nationalism or Russian imperialism and Ukrainian nationalism that continues through that whole period there. Despite coming from a family that was Russian-speaking, having a father who was ethnically Russian, older brother who was a Bolshevik and had no time for Ukrainian ideas at all, he was deeply Russophobic and saw the whole Russian civilization as a threat to Europe. He regarded Bolshevism, communism, as just a new form of Russian messianism, a new form of Russian imperialism that had to be fought by any means necessary. After Symon Petliura's assassination in Paris and the trial of Sholom Schwartzbard that happened after that, he became very anti-Semitic. He began to see the Jews in Ukraine as agents of Russian communism, agents of Russian imperialism, and as time went on, in the 1930s, he begins to embrace National Socialist ideas. He begins to see politics in very ethnic and racial terms. And so, it's important to understand that early in his life, these weren't really his attitudes, but later on, he embraced them. And then after World War II, he tried to distance himself from that period of his public life. Dontsov was in some sense a chameleon, right? Someone that was always adapting to new geopolitical circumstances, taking on new ideas that seemed to be potent or important at the time, and then discarding those later on when they become politically inconvenient. And in a sense, taking his record and manipulating that so that it appears that he always had the same ideas, despite all the changes, all the fluctuations. I suppose the thing that surprised me the most was just how international his experience was, how Because you think of nationalism, you think of it as something very insular, very focused inward. You don't want to have all of these outsiders involved, and yet Dontsov and his circle of followers were very international, very cosmopolitan. And so this is a kind of paradox that I see in it, that it was precisely through his cosmopolitan education, his international experience, that he began to find these radically nationalistic ideas. With the development of the nuclear bomb, he wanted to see a preemptive strike on the Soviet Union, even if it meant the death of millions of Ukrainians potentially. He began to think in terms of a kind of apocalyptic, Christian fundamentalist idea that he thought would appeal to anti-communists in the West. He had a number of connections with church leaders, with politicians who took this sort of McCarthyist stance. And he never softened in his worldview in that way. He wanted to see the Soviet Union destroyed. He talked about it as the quintessence of evil in the world, and something that all decent nations needed to come together around eliminating. He makes Reagan look like a softie. If you read the stuff that he was writing and lecturing in the 1950s and 1960s in Canada, quite extreme, quite extreme. I think everyone that's written about him, I think you were thinking of Myroslav Shkandriy, but also Alexander Motyl, who wrote about the turn to the right, the sort of the intellectual origins of the OUN. They're all in agreement that Dontsov was a sort of founding figure. The spiritual father of Ukrainian integral nationalism, someone that, despite never being a member of the OUN and never accepting sort of responsibility for that organization, someone who gave them their ideology, who articulated the kind of broad geopolitical and ideological program of OUN. Someone like Stepan Bandera was reading him all through his student years. He had a book club, a Dontsov Book Club. I would say that Shkandriy, Motyl, Anders Rudling, everyone that's written about OUN, Bandera, these figures, they all point back to Dontsov as someone who created the ideas. His arrival in Canada was quite controversial. People knew about his history. They knew that he had used his journal to promote Nazism all through the 1930s, that he had worked for the Reinhard Heydrich Institute, and they wanted to see him tried as a war criminal, essentially as someone who had collaborated with Nazi Germany and with its genocide, its crimes in Europe. And so this was actually debated in the Canadian Parliament. The soon-to-be, at the time, Prime Minister of Canada, John Diefenbaker, asked them, we need to find out who Dontsov is. Is he what these people say? And so, Ukrainian leftists in Canada wanted him thrown out. They wanted him arrested or tried. And it was very important for him, therefore, to deny any connection at all to Nazism, to go back and say, I never wrote anything in favor of anti-Semitism. I did not support the Holocaust or anything like that. He goes back, he re-edits his works, he sort of cuts passages that could tie him to this. But I don't think his ideology really changed at that point. I think he continued to see the world in more or less the same terms. He brought in a lot more kind of theological Christian fundamentalist ideas. His job, his position as professor of Slavic literature at the University of Montreal, I mean, he only did this for a couple of years, really. He was able to get this position thanks to a connection with a friend, a biologist, George Rousseau. And then after that, he's quite old, already in his 70s, and basically retires. He goes and lives in Windsor, outside of Montreal, and basically settles down, that's the end of his story. I didn't undertake this project to calumniate Oleh or Dontsov. I mean, I'm really not interested in that. And when I use a term like fascism, I use it in the academic sense of the word, right? I'm not intending to single out Ukrainian nationalists for harsh criticism. This was all very typical for nationalists throughout Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly those that were representing nations that were being oppressed by the Soviet Union, being oppressed by Stalinism. They, in a sense, were quite desperate and turning to any hope that some power could come in and liberate their nation. And a lot of them did look to the Third Reich. They looked to Hitler, to Nazism, for the antidote to Stalinism, the antidote to the Soviet experience. And so this is something that Dontsov came to in part because he was such a Germanophile. He could read German. He was well connected in German circles. And he became very interested in a kind of scientific racialism, a way of looking at the world that saw everything in terms of biological race. And I would encourage those who are skeptical of this to read Vістnik, to look at his articles right on the eve of the Second World War, because this is where he is calling for the implementation of Nazi German approaches to the Jewish question in Ukraine. He is excited about the plans for a German Drang nach Osten, right, an attack on the East. And I would say that if you look at all of his intellectual development up to that point, the various features of fascist ideology are all present. He glorifies warfare. He despises liberalism. He despises democracy. He wants to have everything, all values, whether humanitarian or individual rights, human rights, subordinated to the national interest. And if you have a worldview like that, suddenly any crime is justified in the name of the nation. And that's precisely the position that he was staking out. And none of his contemporaries would have mistaken him on this. He was someone who translated Mein Kampf, someone who tried to popularize fascist ideas in Ukraine, and was quite successful at it. And so I think this is something that has to be reckoned with seriously by people who want to understand the history of this time. And I understand it's painful, it's difficult because of how much it seems to parrot Soviet propaganda or Russian propaganda today that is used against Ukraine and against Ukraine's independence. But as scholars, as academics, we have to look at this right in the face, and we have to be honest about it. I would just encourage you to take a look at the excerpts from the book that are posted on the website. It should be available in early March or mid-March. And he's a really fascinating character. If we could get away from some of the contentious contemporary political debates and just look at the history, I think that it's a really fascinating window onto Ukraine's experience in the 20th century. It's totally understandable that you want to look back into your national history and find heroes, right, and role models. But history is messy, and this isn't something that Ukraine has to deal with by itself. Every country that looks at its history, they want to see this heroic narrative. But when you dig into the weeds, it's not always so pleasant, right? And I think that the best thing you can do is pursue the truth, right? Because the truth never hurts a just cause. And I really believe that, and I would say that about any country in the world. Okay. Well, hey, Will, thanks so much for doing this. This has been great. You too. Bye.